I'm here to talk about Ember.js. This is actually the first big talk I'm giving on Ember in a little while, so if you're familiar at all with Ember, a lot has changed in the past 6 months or so. And so what I'm going to do today is sort of a talk in 3 acts. So I'm going to first start by talking a little bit about what is Ember, why I think it's cool, why I think you should think it's cool, what are the big picture ideas in Ember. I'm not going to go into a lot of nitty-gritty about the implementation because part 2 is just going to be a live demo. I'm going to build an app. And then the third part is me just talking about where the web is going and how Ember fits into that. So I think a lot of times people want to talk about or want to think about, OK, so 2013, April 2013 web, pretty cool. But I can see that some things are changing. How do I future-proof myself? I think there's a difference between how Ember future-proofs itself and how your app future-proofs itself, just because I hope Ember's around in 5 years. But probably most apps that start today are going to be in maintenance mode in 5 years. So, maybe not all, but many apps. So I think there's a difference between how you should think about future-proofing your apps and how we think about future-proofing things. I'll talk really about both of those things towards the end of my talk. So the first thing I want to say is I think now is really a great time to be a web developer. I think there's never been a better time, in fact, to be a web developer. If you go look at pretty much every single website of any person that has a browser, they have hundreds and hundreds of really cool experiments that they want to show you that there's really new things going on. So there's all the Google stuff. Even Microsoft has all these HTML5 labs, new features that they're prototyping that you can play with. I think Mozilla stuff is really cool. Their graphics are the nicest of all the demo sites. But they do really cool stuff. They have like 3D shooters. They have games. I think Firefox OS is really pushing them. So I think if you go back, when I started doing web development solidly in 2005, we were kind of in the dark ages. I think IE6 was still really the only browser. Firefox had just started to pick up a little bit of steam, so people cared a little bit about multiple browsers, but really IE6 had 90% market share. And I think back then, people talked a lot about the fact that, cool story, the next version of JavaScript or whatever someone's working on in HTML5, when am I going to get to use that? And I think that was a reasonable thing to think in 2005 after 5 years of stagnation. But I think people just kept saying that. So in 2013, after the last 5 years of extremely rapid development, and I'll talk about that more at the end of my talk, we're still talking about the web as though 5 years from now we're going to be in a stagnated state. And I think if you look back at the last 5 years, that's just not reasonable. It's not a reasonable way to look at how the web is progressing. But I think even if you just look at 2013, things are really great. It's a really great time to be a web developer. So the first thing I want to sort of talk about is there's 2 websites that I'm showing here. There's the New York Times and Discourse. And the New York Times, of course, is a site that is mostly dealing with content. It's mostly a content-driven website. Discourse also, it's a piece of form software built on Ember, also a content-driven website. The New York Times, I think, is what usually people talk about when they say this is an example of a site you should not build using a single-page app. So the question that I have is why? What are the differences, really, between these 2 sites? And the first thing that I'll say is it's certainly not the amount of JavaScript. If you go look at the New York Times, you'll find that the New York Times has 802 kilobytes of JavaScript and Discourse. This is over-the-wire JavaScript. Discourse has 284 kilobytes. And I'm not saying this to say, look, Ember is so small. 284 kilobytes of JavaScript is nothing to sneeze at. What I'm saying is that sometimes you look at sites, you think this is just a piece of static content, and there's just a ton of JavaScript. In the New York Times' case, there's a bunch of ad stuff. There's external services that they're using for video. There's just all this stuff. And if you look at the New York Times, it ends up adding up to something like 5 seconds of before DOM ready. Discourse has a much smaller time. So it's the answer to the question, what is the difference between these 2 apps, is not how much JavaScript there is. I think people talk about single-page apps or JavaScript-heavy apps as the distinction. And I'm just saying, as a practical matter, in 2013, almost every app that is a serious app that's doing real things on the internet, that is what people would consider just a content app or just a document app, has a lot of JavaScript on it. For whatever reason, it just turns out to be the case. And what I'm saying is that the difference actually is whether the app is designed to be long-lived or not. So I think the reason why people think of the New York Times as a content site and they think of Discourse as an app is that the New York Times, every single time you click on a link, you get a new page. The page gets removed and it gets added. Now, in New York Times' case, there's a lot of JavaScript. So it's not, again, about the amount of JavaScript that gets loaded on any given page. But there is a difference. Discourse has a single piece of JavaScript that gets loaded one time, and then you stay on the discourse page forever. You stay on the discourse page for a long time as you navigate around, as you look at different pieces of content. So these are two different ways of building applications. And if you want to build your app as a long-lived app, as opposed to a short-lived app, what ends up happening is that you have different kinds of data that need to reflect the life cycle of the application. So you have things that usually are called models. And what a model is something that lasts across all sessions. So no matter you reload the page, you bookmark it, you give it to your friend, you command tab, models are basically the same always. Now, they may happen to get stored in local storage, they may get stored in IndexedDB, they may get stored on a server, you might use Meteor, parse. But all these things are examples of pieces of data that are long-lived, that live across the entire lifetime of your application beyond, across page reloads. And then people usually talk about the controller. And I think in most systems that pretend or talk about being MVC in some way or another, this is really the role of the controller. Regardless of where it sits in the architecture, it's managing pieces of data that live across the entire lifetime of your application, but not across reload. So if you, for example, if you have a piece of content that you could expand or contract, a little triangle, maybe that information wants to live across the entire time that your user is moving around the application, because if you move out of a tab and come back to the tab, you don't want that state to go away. But if the user reloads, you're going to want to start from scratch. So usually the controller manages state that's just for this session. And the template or view, whatever you're calling it in your framework du jour, manages what is currently on the screen, what is currently visible. And I think different frameworks do a better or worse job of building an architecture around the fact that this is what is going on. But I think fundamentally this is what's going on. And it's how Ember thinks about the division of responsibilities. It's mostly about the lifetime of your application. So why does it matter what these different pieces of your application, how long they live? So one really big reason is garbage. So obviously, you don't want to be collecting your models. So there are some frameworks that say garbage collection is such an important problem that we're just, as soon as you leave the page, we're going to just nuke your models. And if you happen to come back to it, just make another request to your server. And the problem with that line of reasoning is that the models actually, by definition, are things that should not get nuked. They're, by definition, things that last a very, very long time. Unless you have 100,000 pieces of data or something from your server and you really, really need direct control over the memory, you normally want that stuff to stick around. You want it to be around over the lifetime of your application. And then similarly, a lot of people will end up mashing together their state of things like, is this triangle expander or not, together with their view state, with their template state. And what that can mean is that you have to choose between either leaving all of your views around all the time because they have this important state, and usually that means keeping around DOM nodes, it means keeping around all kinds of expensive state. Or you have to say, you know what, I'm just going to throw it away, and the user is going to come back to this tab, and they're just going to have to re-expand that state. And I think both of those choices are bad. And so what that means is that what you really want is a piece of your architecture that's designed around the second type of state. It's designed around the exact, around long-lived whole session state. And then finally, I think there is room for your view state, which is basically things that if you leave, you can easily regenerate. Because now that you've moved all the important state out of the view, you can easily throw away the DOM and just bring it back to life from the other state. Now, I think one thing that simpler solutions often do is they try to combine some of these levels. So, for example, a lot of backbone apps combine the model and the controller into one place on the grounds that you should just be able to generate your view from some other layer. And I think that's fine. I think there's utility in once you divide up the things that are easily regeneratable and the things that are not. I think that's really a huge win in and of itself. But what we have found is that dividing these things up into 3 layers provides both good semantics for what things can stick around and what things should be nuked, but also general organization. So I think it turns out that there's good organization reasons to differentiate between things that are going to be sticking around when you reload the page and things that are just temporary for this particular session. So really what Ember tries to do is it tries to think about ways to divide up your application into reasonable buckets, particularly these 3 buckets. So that's number 1. Number 2 is Ember is just HTML. So some of you might know Ember's history. We come from the Sprout Core framework. And Sprout Core, like a lot of frameworks that were being created around that time, Cappuccino, Ext.js, they try to abstract away HTML. They try to tell you, you just write some JavaScript, you write some widgets, and we'll put some HTML on the screen for you. And I think the problem with that is that people already know HTML, people already know CSS. Either on your own or with the rest of a team, you have techniques for dealing with CSS. Somebody's going to write a piece of HTML and give it to you. You need to use it. You need to use some CSS that already exists. Maybe your application already has a style that you want to use. And being told, no problem, just rewrite your theme using Cappuccino's theming system. That doesn't really, it's fine if you're going to really bet everything on that and spend months and months to figure out how the system works. But I think it's a lot better to just say, we're just doing HTML. We're adding some features to HTML. So an example of this would be in Ember, if you have an image tag, which is the top, you can actually bind automatically without Ember having to know anything about an image tag. You can bind its source attribute to some piece of model state. So you can imagine having a URL attribute on your model, and you can bind the source attribute to that. And if it happens to change, the image will automatically update. And I think the really great thing about the fact that it's based on HTML, DOM, attributes, is that if you go and you have an audio tag, which has an SRC, so the web is all based around tags and attributes, the same exact techniques work without Ember having to do anything special, without Ember having to learn any new tricks. The normal attribute binding solutions, the normal mechanisms for building HTML, all that stuff will continue to work. So I think this actually turned out to be really cool. We were doing a training a few months ago, and we wanted to do an audio application, and we didn't have to add anything to Ember for it to handle the audio tag, which was really great. So again, I think the important thing here is we don't want to replace HTML. We think HTML is the way that people should build applications. We want to add to it. We want to augment it to it using Handlebars, which is a very popular templating engine already. We basically use that same templating engine to add features to HTML, but which are live bound, which are going to be working inside of Ember. So that's number 2. And number 3 is URLs. So I think a lot of people look at URLs. They start with building something like the New York Times, and you get URLs for free, and people get really used to using URLs in all kinds of contexts. And then they go to build a single-page application, and they're so busy with the UI, with the UX, whatever their designer gave them, that they completely forget URLs. They completely forget that URLs exist. So for example, to do MVC today handles URLs. So today, you'll see the little R box means that there's URL support in the do MVC example. But the first version of to do MVC didn't support URLs at all. So you would go learn about how to build a single page web application using all these frameworks, and there was nothing at all in the first version about URLs. Now, of course, it became obvious to Addy that this is an important feature, so he added it as a requirement. But I think, unfortunately, for many frameworks, this is a sort of tack-on feature. It's something that you think about down the road. Do I really need a URL, or do I not need a URL? And I think the interesting thing is that when you look at applications like Discourse, or applications like Facebook, keep your eye on the URL bar, or applications like Twitter, or even applications like Rdio, you find out that people who are doing this for real, people who are really building web applications, no matter how single-pagey they are, have really good URL experiences. People really think hard about how to make URLs good. And that's because people expect that when they're inside of the browser, they expect the UI to be, there is a URL bar, and you can copy something, and it will have something to do with the current state of where you are, and you can share that state with your friends. So I took a look at my Twitter feed yesterday, just randomly, the top posts, and I noticed that pretty much every post on here has a URL in it. And I think it's easy to forget when you're going and you're building these single-page applications. You're jumping in and you're focusing on all the single-pagey, the JavaScript-heavy, the client-side application. It's easy to forget that the way that people still mostly interact with the web is as a URL box on top, bar on top, and a black box on the bottom, and they want to make sure that as they're moving around conceptually around the application into different areas of content, that they can copy something from there and paste it. I think, for example, it's kind of annoying that in Gmail, not in Gmail, in Google Maps, you have to say, give me a URL. I think those UIs, everybody can feel something's wrong about that, right? That you want to just be able to copy it out of the URL bar. Why do I have to ask for a URL? Why is this not working? What is that URL bar for in the first place? And what I would say is the URL is actually, if you want to think about what is the UI of the web, how is the web different from native, fundamentally the URL is the UI of the web. People use the UI for bookmarking. People use it for sharing with other people on Twitter, on Facebook, on Google+. People use it for emailing. I looked at my email box. 80% of the top 50 emails in my email box had a URL, one or more URLs in them. So people really want to be able to pass around URLs to their application. People use the command tab feature to open things in a new tab, or right-click, open in a new tab. Right? People are really relying on the fact that as they're navigating around applications, they get URL support. And I would go a little bit further to say, if your application doesn't have URL support, it is not a web app. It's an application. It happens to be delivered using web technologies. You happen to get to it through the web browser. But the application fundamentally is an application, is not a web application. It's an application written using JavaScript. And I think one thing that's interesting is that once you start thinking of URLs as fundamental to what you're doing, what you realize is that there's a lot of places where you would think this is a completely inappropriate place for URLs, but where it's really valuable. So for example, imagine I'm playing a first-person shooter, and I could just grab the URL, and I am my friend. Hey, why don't you join me here? Now, obviously, you're not going to give your friend all the state, exactly, all the exact specific state that you have, but maybe it will give them enough information to join you at the appropriate level or around the same location that you are in the game. Imagine that I'm in Gmail, and I can just take a link, the current URL for an email, and send it to my friend who I see is CC'd. So I say, hey, friend, I would like you to go look at this email, and I can see that you're CC'd, so you should have access to it. Why don't you go take a look at this, instead of telling them, go search for this subject line. Or I think one of my favorite examples is if you go into the Chrome settings, you get everything you do, including modal dialogues, is a URL. And I think that's really helpful. Sometimes my mom calls up and she says, I don't really know what to do. I'm trying to add something to my Chrome. I'm trying to change this setting. And the fact that I can go in there, go exactly to where I need to be, and I am her a link that says, here's where you need to go in the settings. This seems pretty unusual in the sense that it's my personal settings. I have a modal dialogue up. What does this have to do with URLs? But when you think about how valuable it is to share with your friends, share via email, share via bookmarking, don't think about whether or not you should add a URL. You should be thinking about whether it's appropriate to eliminate it, whether it's appropriate to leave it out. So this is, I think, fundamentally what Ember is about today. It's about making it so that you don't have a choice. If you want to opt out of URLs, you have to think hard and long about it, and you basically get URLs as part of the package of building an Ember application. So with that, why don't I go build something? So let's build an application. So let me swap. Okay, so now I'm just going to go and build an app. Okay, so let me just start. So here I've downloaded the Ember Starter Kit. I've made a few small tweaks to it. The first thing is that I'm using the Ember Nightly build instead of the one that we just released. There's a few changes in it that matter to me. I've also included the Showdown library, which is a Markdown library. And I've also included the Twitter Bootstrap library, CSS framework. And what I'm going to be doing today is build a simple Markdown editor, a little place for you to have a list of files that you can edit, etc. So we're going to start by just allowing me to edit my name. So I want to have an input tag here. So input type equals text, value equals name. And then we're going to put an H1 here, which basically says Markdown files by name. OK, so a few things I want to point out here. So this here is a script tag, and it's basically just a template. It's the main template for your application. It doesn't have a name, so it's basically what Ember will use if you don't do anything. If you don't have any URLs, it's going to render this first. So also, I want to point out this input tag here is basically, it's obviously not using angle brackets, and that's because it's dynamic. So it's basically the same thing as a regular input tag, but it has dynamic properties. In this case, we're going to say that its value is the same as this name thing, and that's going to be bound to this name field over here. So let me open it. Can you see that? Great. So I'm going to say Yehuda Katz, and great, so it works. So that's the first starting point. Unfortunately, if I reload now, of course, it's going to get lost. So let's fix that. Let's have that information get persisted to local storage. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to tell my input that it has an action, which is save name. And that action by default is going to get triggered when I hit enter. So I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to create the application controller. And the application controller is basically just the object that handles events from the application template. So it's going to be an Ember controller. And I'm going to say save name. It's going to get the value, which is the current name that's in the text box. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, OK, I want to save this to local storage. So local storage dot say app name equals value. And so that's fine. That's going to save it. But of course, I also need to load it in the first place from somewhere. So I'm going to say that there's an initialization here. So this is just a constructor function for this controller. And I'm going to say this.set name local storage.appname. So basically what I've done here is we have this template over here. It's getting its information from the controller that is the same name, the application controller. And what we're doing is we're saying whenever this controller gets initialized, which is going to happen right away when the application boots, set its name property to the local storage information. And when you hit enter, which is going to trigger this save name function, I should probably, great, then save it to local storage. So let me do this, Yehuda Katz. And now let's go here. We can see local storage app name, right? Correct. And if I reload, you'll see it works. And importantly, you can see that both the input field and the text over here got the information. So now we've stored the information in local storage. So now the next thing that I want to do is I want to list out all the files that I have. So in order to do this, I'm going to make a second template. So it's going to be script type equals text x handlebars. And now I'm going to say data template name equals files. And this is going to be a list of all the files that I have. And you'll see over here, I have basically created a list of files over here that have a little slug, a title, et cetera. And then I've also, over here, all I've done is I've made that same array, have indexed them by the slug. So that way, later on, when I'm going to want to get it from the URL, I have an easy way to get it. So of course, in practice, you would probably do something a little more complicated than this. But this is just for demo purposes. It's pretty straightforward. So what I want to do here, and I'm going to grab some HTML from, hold on. I'm going to grab some Twitter Bootstrap HTML from here. Let me. So it's just simple Twitter Bootstrap. We have a container. We have a row span 3, which is a table, which has a list of files in it. And then span 9, which is where we're going to put the individual files. Actually, I'll kill that for now. So we reload it, and nothing happens. And so that seems problematic. And the reason that nothing happened is, as I said before, everything in Ember is driven by a URL. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to provide a URL for that file's location. So we're going to say this.resource files. OK? So now if I go back and add files, again, nothing's going to happen. So why has nothing happened? Well, the reason nothing happened is that I haven't told the application where it should put that files template inside of my main template. So of course, this is the template that we want to appear all the time, no matter what we're doing. And we need to say, OK, here's an outlet, and that means when you want to put another template in, here's the place that it goes. So now if I reload, you can see, great, so the other template appears. Now, unfortunately, having it be a piece of static content is not very useful. If I keep going down this path, you're going to start wondering why I'm not using Django or Rails or something like that. So let's do some dynamic content. So here we can see we're inside of a table with a tr. And I'm going to say each file in model. And I'm going to say, here's a tr, here's a td, and I'm going to say, should be each file, sorry. File dot, was it title? Yep, file dot title by file dot author. Nice. Okay, so we're going to have a problem, though. If we reload, of course, we have no model. So, so far, we've said loop over all the things that are in my model, but we have not told it what the model is, so it's looping over nothing. So what we need to do is we need to tell it what the model is, and the way you do that in Ember is that you create a route. So app.files route. And there's a function called model over here. And basically, this model is just you tell it what the model is, and then that becomes the model inside of your template by the same name. So we're just going to return files here. Right? And that basically is going to say this array of files is going to become the model over here that we're looping over. It's by the same name. So great. So now we've looped over the model. So awesome. So the next thing we probably want to do is, OK, I want to actually go look at one of those individual files. So you guessed it, then we're going to want to make another template for each individual file. So script type equals text x handlebars. Data template name equals individual file / script. And what we're going to do is we're going to say h2 title / God. Sublime is really screwing me here. h3 author, we'll say by author / h3. And then we will just put a div here. Let me see if nope, just a div. And we're going to put the contents in here, right? So basically now we're looking at an individual file, and we want to put the title, author, and contents. So again, as you probably expected, so we have a template here, but we haven't actually said how to get to it. So we need to provide a route for individual files. So let's go back to our router. We're going to say that we want a resource for individual file. And in this case, we have to provide a path. And the reason we have to provide a path is, of course, there are many different files, and it's not, instead of there just being one file. So we need to provide a little dynamic segment there that says this is going to be the file's ID. Now, if I was to go to files / let's say one of the IDs is Rails is omakase, and hit enter, nothing is going to happen. And if you go look at it, it's going to say, hey, assertion failed. You used the dynamic segment. Hold on, let me disable this so that it does not cause problems in the future. It says, hey, you used the dynamic segment file ID, but you didn't have app.file, which is how other Ember data hooks into it. But also, you did not override your routes. You cannot get to the other side. But it basically says you didn't override your routes model hook. So in order to actually say what file to use, we have to override the routes model hook. So let's go do that. So we have basically the same thing, app.individual file route equals ember.route.extend. It has a model. This time it's going to take a list of all the parameters that came in from the URL. We have a files ID. And we're going to return files params.file ID, right? So that param is going to come from here, and we've indexed this little loop over here, indexed all of them by their ID. So now we are going to do that. So now we can see that we have gone to files Rails is omakase, and now we can see that it's here. Well, there's one small issue here, which is that you can see, if you look at the original source, that there is, it's hard to see it, but it is Markdown. And we would like that to actually be Markdown. So it actually would be easier if we go to yRuby. So we can see that there is some Markdown here, and we would like to actually present that as Markdown. We would not like to present that as just plain text. So the way that you do this in Ember is that you create what is called a helper. So I've included the Showdown library, and the Showdown library is going to allow us to convert normal text into HTML. And we're going to say ember.handlebars.helper Markdown. It's a function which takes a value, which is basically just whatever it is that we want to convert. We're going to say var converter equals new showdown.converter, and then we're going to return converter.make HTML value. Now we just go back here. We say, OK, we would like this contents to be displayed as Markdown. We refresh. Well, so this is not exactly what we wanted. We can see that everything's escaped. So the reason that everything's escaped is that in Ember, by default, any text that you put into the page gets escaped. And this is to prevent you from having to deal with XSS. In order to tell Ember specifically that what you want here is something that is safe, so I know that I put it through Markdown, therefore I know that it's safe, what I do is I can go here and I can say this is a new handlebars.safe string. And that basically says you can safely render this as HTML, and now it's HTML. There's something weird with the CSS here, but OK. And you can see, by the way, that as I go back and forth, everything is doing the right thing. Well, so we've done all this, but now if we go back to the files list, we have no way to actually get to the individual pages. So that sucks. Well, there's good news, which is that we have already specified the route for file. So we can just go in here, and we can say link to individual file, and then we just pass the file that's currently in scope. This is a little weird. And then we close the link to. So what's happening here is that we have a file in scope, a file object, and we're basically passing it along. And what's going to happen is that Ember is going to automatically pull its ID out, and it's going to use that as the URL to generate the URL. It's basically going to replace this little segment over here with the ID from that object. So now if I refresh it, you can see that there is URLs if you see on the bottom, right? Rails is omakase. If I click on it, great, it's going to come in here. So great, so we've done good so far. And if you go back, of course, you get the list. Now, I hope that what you're noticing is that everything in Ember is really URL driven. There's not an easy way to think about these things in terms of, oh, I just want to click on this and have something appear. You really think about it in terms of URLs, but we've made it so simple to use URLs that you really have no excuse not to. So you get really the benefits of sharing bookmarking. So for example, if I go back here and command click, if I go down here and open link a new tab, you'll see that it, of course, does the right thing, which means if I put it on Twitter or something, it's all going to work. So that's great. So now the last thing I want to do before I get into editing, how much time do I have? Does anyone know? OK, great. I'm still on track. So the last thing that I want to do before I get into editing is, what if I want to actually leave them both on the same screen at the same time? So I want to have what is called a nested UI, so sort of like what Gmail has, where you leave along the list on the left side, even though you're in the middle of viewing something on the right side. So this is something that can be a little bit tricky in some frameworks. In Ember, we thought about the way that our outlets and our routes work from the ground up to support this use case. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put in the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say that our route should be nested. So instead of having two separate routes, we're going to grab this, and we're going to put it inside. And of course, we don't need to put files here anymore, right? So now we have it nested inside. But there's going to be a small issue, which is that if I go to Rails' omakase, nothing is going to happen. And the reason is similar to what happened before, which is that I haven't actually told Ember where to put that child template. So I've told Ember, I would like you to render the file template inside of the files template, but I have not actually told it where to put it. So that's actually rather straightforward how to fix it. So we basically go here. We create another div with class equals, let's say, span9. And inside of that div, we throw in an outlet. And now what we can see is that, the child template, we can see that we have a child route, files, and then inside of it is Rails' omakase. And we can see that that same route structure that we've set up over here represents the nesting of the UI structure. So basically, you can have nested UIs and have them be reflected in the URL very, very simply, which is great. Now, another thing that I thought I would point out is that you can see that these Y Ruby and Rails omakase are becoming bolded as I click on them. And that's because when you use the link to helper, we are automatically adding an active class if the thing that you are rendering happens to be the current active state. So without you having to do any additional work, you can just have this active state. And if you look at the CSS here, you can just see that I have said when a link is active, make it bold, a different color. Great. So now the very last thing that I want to show you in the demo is, OK, what if I want to actually edit these individual files? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my file, and I'm going to add some text. I'm going to add some form fields. So input, well, let's throw in a label. Label 4 equals title. Title / label. And then I'm going to put an input, type equals text. I'm going to have ID equals title. And then I'm going to have value equals title. What is going on here? Great. Value equals title. And then I'm going to say /men. And now you can see that if I go and change things, you can see that it's changing in all of the locations. And now I'll just do a few more of these, right? I'll add a text field for the author. And I will add a text area for the contents. And this, so this guy is going to be a text area. Its ID is going to be contents, and its value is going to be contents. So if I go in here, and actually let me throw in, I can add rows equals 10. Great. So now if I want to go in and say, I want to say Rails is omakase, you can see that I'm getting a live Markdown editor over here. And I didn't really have to write any code to make that live Markdown editor work. The fact that it's going through the Markdown helper and the fact that it's bound to the same data attributes, that's making everything just work. Everything is just hooked up together without me having to do anything else. OK, and the last thing I want to show is basically, OK, I probably don't want to have these edit options open the entire time. So let me make it possible to just optionally put in edit or not. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull out this block here into a partial. So I'm going to say script type equals text x handlebars. Data template name equals file / form / script. The one time it was useful. OK, so I have this form. And then inside of here, the first thing I'm going to do is just change it to a partial file / form. And that's going to basically throw in the partial. So you'll see, OK, everything, of course, still works as before. But what we want to do is we want to say, OK, I only want to show this form if I'm in editing mode. So I'm going to say, OK, if I'm in editing mode, show the form and show a button whose action is done. And I'll put this done thing here. Otherwise, just show a button that goes into edit and have an edit button. OK, so /if. And we have an edit button, but of course I haven't told it to do anything, so that's not going to do us a lot of good. So we're inside of the file template, so we're going to handle these actions through the file controller. So let's go over here, and we'll say app.fileController equals ember.objectController.extend. And the object controller is basically just because we're showing an individual object here instead of a list, which would be an array controller. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say, OK, the default for isEditing is going to be false. And then we're going to have a method called edit. And that method called edit is going to say this.set is editing true. And we're going to have a done, which is going to say this.set is editing false. OK? Now if I press the edit button, we get all the things. If I say done, we're done. So I actually had more in my demo, which was to now hook up this saving to local storage. The way I'll just describe how you do it, and it can be left as an exercise to the reader. So we already talked about how to do local storage here. You would basically do a similar thing down here, and when you click done, you would basically persist the current object to local storage. And when you booted up the application, you would read all the objects out of local storage in the first place. So instead of hard coding this files list, you would be getting it out of local storage. And everything would just work exactly the same. You wouldn't have to change basically anything about your application other than how you happen to persist the data into local storage instead of in memory. So cool. So that's the demo. And now let me move on to the future of the web. So now we have built something. So I want to reiterate that I think it's really never been a better time to be a web developer. You can do really cool stuff. You can see there's 3D. Mozilla has just released a first-person shooter that runs at nearly native speeds using 3D. So you look at this. This is a series of features that are common in native environments. And actually, we have all these features today on the web. We have typed arrays, which basically allow you to control granularly blocks of memory with integers and not have to worry about the GC. We have web sockets that let you open up sockets to anywhere. We have web workers, which allow you to have threads. We have WebGL, which is basically a port of OpenGL to the web. And we even have ASM.js now, which allows you to compile C directly into something that runs maybe only 1.5 or 2 times slower than C, even though it's compiled down into JavaScript. So Mozilla has recently shipped this thing, which basically will look at a subset of JavaScript and compile it directly into C. So it's a little bit around the side, but it's compatible with any JavaScript, which means it runs in Chrome today. Chrome hasn't shipped any kind of special C optimizations. It runs in Chrome today, a little bit slower, of course, than Mozilla, but there's now a path to running something that is very, very close to native speeds directly on the web, so you can compile your C code directly to the web. So we've gotten really, really far. I think this is what I was talking about before. If you look 5 years ago, basically none of these features existed, and now all these features existed. The web is really moving forward quickly. I don't think there's a lot that you can't do today on the web platform, and I think if you go a year from now, that will be even more the case. I think between Mozilla and Google and even Microsoft, I think we're really making a lot of progress. So I want to talk a little bit about ES6. So I'm a member of TC39, which is the committee that works on the next version of JavaScript. And the thing that we're working on right now most heavily is ES6. And one thing that really excites me is today, every single framework, every backbone, Ember, Angular, Knockout, all of us have our own systems for doing something that's like a class-like abstraction, which makes it really hard for Ember to publish some little library and for Angular to use it, or vice versa, or for Ember to build on top of Backbone, because there's so much cruft just in terms of building up a usable JavaScript runtime model. And ES6 provides a single class-like abstraction that everyone can use. And so what I would hope that would happen in the near future is that people like Ember could really build on top of the lower-level abstractions that other people are building, because we might share the same abstractions. And I think that's really that fun thing about ES6. But for me, what's even more exciting is that once you start going down this path of having class-like abstractions and a lot of the other features that are in ES6, which I don't have time to talk about, we start getting to a point where we could start thinking about things like this. So web components are a feature that allow you to basically build your own elements. And part of the idea behind web components is that you should be able to just subclass HTML elements. So you could imagine that in a few years, Ember views will just be subclasses of HTML elements. They won't be this heavy special abstraction that's trying to deal with deficiencies of the web. They will instead just be subclasses of HTML element. And I think when we think about the future, we don't really think about trying to polyfill this type of thing right now, because by definition, it's almost impossible to polyfill right now. But what we think about is building the Ember architecture so that it's easy to swap in. So we're taking a very close look at all these things. I'm actually involved closely in a lot of the work that's going into this. And we're thinking about, OK, so as we're closing in on Ember 1.0, as we start work on Ember 1.1, what can we do that will make us more easy to adopt these things in the future? And I think it's worth mentioning that, like I said earlier, for Ember, this is crucial. For Ember, we're going to be around in 2 or 3 years when this stuff drops. And if we have to go spend a year to refactor everything we did to take advantage of new features, we're going to be hosed. But for your application, I don't think you want to pay the short-term performance penalties and complexity penalties to try to get high-fidelity polyfills of these features. So I think for your application, what you want is the best possible performance, the simplest possible architecture that works on today's web. But you also want it to be future-proof. You want us to be thinking about what it means in 3 years for Ember to still exist and to adopt these new features. So that's we take a sort of pragmatic, middle-of-the-road approach. We're not trying to polyfill what looks like might happen in a few years. We don't even really know yet. But we are looking very closely at what looks like is going to happen to think about how that fits into our mental model of the world. And I think one thing that's really interesting to me, when you look at all those new features, you look at, we have sockets now, we have malloc, we have WebGL. One thing that we don't have, even web components, one thing that we don't have is anything that's really taking a look at the higher level architecture point. I think URLs are crucial, and there's really nothing in the web platform that's trying to take a look at how you should make people build front-end web applications that are URLs front and center. I think that's something that Ember is doing, and I hope that in the future the web platform tackles it. But for now, really, it's left to frameworks to tackle the architecture point. And I think for now, this is something that we're looking at both how to take advantage of these new features like web components, but also how to make sure that you have a higher level abstraction for building your application that doesn't stop at the HTML level. So custom HTML tags is great, but that's really not the end of the story. I think we all know custom HTML elements are a much nicer way of building jQuery UI, but jQuery UI really isn't enough to build an application. And I think everybody knows that. So we're really thinking about a higher level. We're not just thinking about building more, making HTML better, although that's certainly a part of what we're doing, but we're also thinking about what the architecture of an application looks like. Like I said, Ember plans to be around for a long time. We're not planning on going anywhere, so we're really thinking about what it means to be future-proof and how it fits in with the direction of the web. I think for me, things like class, view, extends, HTML element is really the core of how we think about things going in the future. But I think one thing that I would point out is that nothing is done yet. There's a lot that has changed about web components just in the past few months. So it's quite hard to talk about, OK, we know web components are going to be X, or this ASM.js is going to be Y. Therefore, we are going to bet hard on the exact state of the feature today. We're thinking about sort of the bigger picture, what it means to subclass an HTML element, and less about the exact specifics of how that is going to work. I have just a couple slides left. So here are features that if I were you, I would keep an eye on. These are features that we are thinking hard about how they fit into Ember. So things like modules. ES6 is going to have a standard module system that sort of replaces CommonJS and AMD and YUI module loader, all these things. Just like there's a class abstraction that replaces everyone's classes, there's a module abstraction that replaces everyone's modules. We're thinking about how that fits in, because right now pretty much everyone does this single global application namespace. Modules are a different way of thinking about things, so we're sort of building the core of how Ember looks up objects so that it's compatible with both a single application namespace and module lookup. Similarly, classes are going to be around. Ember is thinking about how to do that. Object.observe and array.observe are really exciting. They're basically a mechanism for getting information without having to override set and get about what things have changed in an object. Both of those are really exciting. They're things that Google has been working on for the past year or so together with TC39. I've been watching with great excitement as every meeting they come in with more information. They've already shipped an experiment inside of Chrome behind a flag. So this is really exciting to me. And it's the sort of thing that I don't think we can get high fidelity today, but we definitely want to build our architecture. So for example, object.observe delivers messages asynchronously. Doesn't deliver them immediately when the change happens. So Ember from the beginning has always followed this, has always not try to make any guarantees about when exactly messages will get delivered. And we're thinking about even more going further in that direction so that it will be easier to adopt object.observes when it lands. Proxies are basically a way of overriding every set, every get, the in call, all these things directly on an object. And we're thinking about how to make Ember objects feel better so you don't have to go through these special APIs, right? So you go through what look like the standard APIs, but you get the benefits because now you can override basically everything. And like I said, web components are coming in the future. They're still changing a lot, but the idea of an Ember view just being a subclass of an HTML element is really exciting to me. So I'll close by saying, yet again, there's never been a better time to to be a web developer. We can see things like high fidelity. Unreal just announced with Mozilla that their Unreal Engine is coming to JavaScript through ASM.js, which is really awesome. There are really great things coming down the pike. Ember gives you the tools to build applications that leverage all these things, that thinks about the future, but we don't want to forget about the feature that made the web possible and exciting and awesome in the first place, which is the humble URL. Thank you very much.